Our first speaker tonight is going to be George Werthner, and George is the author of 34 books, including California Wilderness Areas, Oregon Wilderness Areas, and many others, including one, I think, Montana Magnificent Wilderness. Is that correct? And he has personally visited more than 365 designated wilderness areas around the West. Our second speaker will be Tina Marie Ecker, and Tina Marie grew up campaigning and backpacking in the mountains of Arizona and later spent 9 summers working for the National Park Service and Bureau of Land Management. She field mapped potential wilderness study areas in Arizona and Utah, conducted an off-road vehicle study in northern Utah, and worked as a backcountry ranger in southern Utah's Escalante Canyons. For the past 6 years, Tina Marie has been policy director at Wilderness Watch, a national conservation organization headquartered in Missoula. David Cole is will be our last speaker on your left, and David is a Forest Service research scientist at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute here in Missoula. He has degrees in geography from the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Oregon, and has been conducting research in wildernesses around the country for the past 30 years. He has co-authored several books, including Soft Paths, which provided the scientific foundation for the Leave No Trace program, and in 2002 was named Scientist of the Year by the National Park Service. All right, so how about a round of applause for our 3 speakers?
Question?
Oh, those 2 nominated you to go first.
I get that.
How much time do I have?
Oh, 15 to 20 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I decided what I'd do is give some background on sort of conservation history that may help all of us talk about the future of wilderness. And so I'm not going to talk about the future right now as much as give you some of the past and maybe what its implications are for the future. And then maybe when the rest of the other speakers talk, you'll have questions and we can go from there. So I wanted to tell you some of the conservation history, particularly the sense of history in terms of how most of our conservation successes have been viewed between on a local scale versus support from outside the local area, and what the implications are for that. And I'm going to start with Yellowstone Park, which everybody here is probably familiar with because you're living in Montana. But what you may not know, even as popular as Yellowstone is today, that when it was first proposed and created in 1872 as a national park, mostly due to politicians and scientists and others from the eastern United States, the state of Montana for 20 years afterwards introduced legislation into Congress to designate Yellowstone National Park. Editorials in the Helena and some of the other papers said that this was going to ruin the state, taking all that land out of production that it could have been for cattle ranching and logging, or the privatization of those hot springs and so forth as major tourist attractions. And so the attitude was, if we make it a park, it's going to be the worst thing that could happen. And of course, today, I think there would be universal support for keeping Yellowstone. There may be issues about how to deal with things in Yellowstone, but I think you would find very little support today in Montana for getting rid of Yellowstone Park. But that was the attitude when it was first designated. Then I'm going to go to another example, Yosemite, which was created in 1890. Yosemite was also initially set aside as a state park. A lot of people don't know that. But it was due to what was felt to be mismanagement and giving away too many of the prized things in the valley to private enterprise, so to speak, that there was a public outreach that finally led to the establishment of it as a national park, largely led by John Muir. And one of the interesting things, particularly about John Muir, that I love, is he lobbied to get the whole watershed of the Merced and the Tuolumne rivers included. Initially, they were just going to protect the valley, with the waterfalls and El Capitan and all that. And he thought bigger. He wanted to get it all the way over and take in the headwaters. And in fact, at one time, Yosemite was larger. It went over those who know Yosemite. It stops at the divide of the Sierras. It lopped over into the other side of the eastern part of the Sierra Nevada divide, but was reduced later to allow mining in some of the areas up near the divide there. But again, that was a process of of using political pressure from outside of the local area to help create Yosemite Park. Another example of this is the Adirondacks, which is a state park. It's the largest state park in the United States, 6 million acres in the borders of the park, which makes it 3 times the size of Yellowstone Park, or twice the size of the state of Connecticut. And Adirondack State Park was established, again, as a reaction to overexploitation. It was because of logging and other things that were going on in the headwaters of the Hudson River in particular that got people upset throughout the state of New York, particularly in New York City and in Albany, New York, which unified them in trying to protect that area, the watershed, because there was fears that the Hudson River might dry up. There was, a lot of fears about how logging was going to affect watershed, and the Hudson River being an important port for New York City and so forth. There was a lot of support, public support then, to create the Adirondack State Park, again, over the objections of a lot of the people in the state park. And there's still a lot of people in the Adirondack State Park that don't like the fact that there's a park there. But although I would say that the state of New York as a whole loves it, and more recently, for example, the state of New York voters have passed multiple bond issues to keep buying land within the boundaries of this park to put more and more under public ownership. And another example, and along the same lines, and this is a great story, I hope you love these stories, Baxter State Park in Maine. Baxter State Park is named for Percival Baxter, who was the governor of Maine, and it takes in the highest point in Maine, which is Mount Katahdin, and he wanted to protect it. So he was governor for 2 terms, and he tried to get the state of Maine to protect Baxter and the area around Mount Katahdin. And the state refused it because it was dominated mostly by timber companies, and they wanted to keep on logging the forest. So Baxter started buying up the land and eventually donated it to the state of Maine. And you know what Maine said? They said, no thanks, we don't want it. And so then he bribed them. He said, okay, I'll give you money if you'll take the park that I want to give to you, and I will pay forever all the management for it. And only then did they reluctantly agree to accept his park. And today, if you go to Maine, it's the biggest thing in Maine, Baxter State Park. Everybody's proud of it in Maine and thinks it's the best thing that ever happened. Grand Canyon National Park. This is another great story. I love this story. Teddy Roosevelt, who was president of Grand Canyon, was designated a national monument in 1906. And that was when Teddy Roosevelt was president. And some of you know about, maybe you don't know, I'll give you a background. There's a thing called the Antiquities Act that allows the president to declare anything a national monument. And it was first passed during Roosevelt's term as president. And Roosevelt was very interested in protecting the Grand Canyon area, and he couldn't get the Senate and Congress to do anything about it, so House. So he finally decided he was going to try to designate it a national monument. So he calls up, I guess, the Attorney General or whatever, and he asks him, does this law have any size limit on it? And the Attorney General looks at the law and says, no, it doesn't say what size it could be. See, when the Congress passed the Antiquities Act, they were thinking they were going to protect these little, like, Indian rooms here and there, or maybe a petrified tree or something, just very small things. And so Teddy Roosevelt said, well, there's no size limit. Okay, I hereby declare that 1 million acres around the Grand Canyon is now a national monument. Well, Arizona was just incredibly upset that he would take all this land away from mining and so forth. And they were kind of sneaky about what they did. They actually came back. Well, first of all, they tried to make sure that there was no money appropriated for taking care of the new Grand Canyon National Monument. And which is a trick which was, by the way, repeated when the Mojave National Park was created in California also, more recently. But then they decided, well, the only way they're going to get rid of this, because it was really popular to protect the Grand Canyon nationally, was to subvert it by creating a national park. So they introduced legislation into Congress that made a Grand Canyon National Park, because Congress is the only one that can designate a national park, except that this national park was 1/3 the size of Teddy Roosevelt's national monument. So by making it a national park, they suddenly opened up all this land to mining and logging and so forth, like the Kaibat Plateau, which some of you might know about. And over time now, we have gradually added back to it. So the most recent additions to the Grand Canyon now make it back to the size that Teddy Roosevelt originally set aside, different configuration, but the general same acreage that he had in 1906. And the really interesting thing I see in this story is back, you remember when a number of years ago Congress failed to pass a budget and the federal government shut down? Well, the state of Arizona was so upset that the Grand Canyon was going to be closed that they volunteered to pay for ranger salaries and so forth so they could keep the Grand Canyon open and operating. What a difference from the original reaction to Arizonans to the creation of the Grand Canyon. Well, another good story is the Grand Teton National Park. Grand Teton National Park, as many of you probably know, the original valley bottom lands, the ranch lands in the Jackson Hole area, were bought up by John D. Rockefeller. And he did this secretly. He formed a land company that went in and bought up ranches as they came in for sale. And then finally he donated it to the federal government to be designated as a national monument, because you can give it to the president can declare it a national monument, which was done. Then immediately, the state of Wyoming's congressional delegation, what do? They introduced legislation in the Congress to get rid of Grand Teton National Park. And the editorial in Jackson Hole was, new national monument will make Jackson a ghost town. Well, if you've been to Jackson lately, you know it's anything but a ghost town. And yet that was the attitude. It didn't pass their attempt to get Grand Teton Park eliminated. Another good story is Olympic National Park. And this is another one I love. Teddy Roosevelt had a hand in this too. He declared Olympic national monument back when he was president, back in around 1906 or 1908 or something like that. And that was a core area, but it was there was talk and more talk to try to protect it. It was mostly the mountain areas that he had as a national monument. So they wanted to protect the lower elevations where all the big trees were. And of course the Olympic Peninsula is a big timber company, lots of logging and so forth. So all the locals didn't want to see this happen. And a lot of that was part of the Olympic National Park, the lower elevations, forest, lower elevations with national forest. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt, coming to the 1930s, there was more and more pressure to create a national park there, protect the lower elevation stuff. And so he decided to come out and see this place for himself. So he comes out to Port Angeles and he meets the forest supervisor. And they go on this road tour. And they come to these massive clear cuts. And they're driving through the clear cuts. And he says to the supervisor, he says, "Boy, I hope the person who did this rots in hell." And little did he know that he was going across national forest land. And the reason he didn't know that was that the forest supervisor had told a couple of seasonals to take the sign that said, "Welcome to the Olympic National Forest," and move it to the very edge of all the clear cuts. And so they get through all these clear cuts and they get to the national forest, and it's all this old growth forest, and Roosevelt is starting to think, well, maybe we don't need a national park. The Forest Service seems to be doing a good job. And so he gets interviewed back in Seattle and he says, I don't know, maybe we don't need a park here. And the guys had moved the sign, read this in the paper, and they write a letter to the president, which I guess he actually read in those days. And so this letter gets to him, and they said, well, we moved the sign. And when he found that out, he said, okay, man, this is a national park. The hell with the Forest Service. So that's how they got that. And we can come up to a more current thing was in the 1980s, the Alaska Lands Bill. That created all the national parks and wildlife refuges in Alaska. If you had been in Alaska at that time, and I was, you were odd man out if you were supporting having parks up there at that time. And in fact, Jimmy Carter, in order to protect the land there, declared all these 130 million acres of national monuments. One time swoop. Fell swoop up there in Alaska. And then Congress in 1980 passed the Alaska Lands Bill that created all these national parks and wildlife refuges and so forth, and basically certified what Carter had set aside. But again, the point was that a lot of the local people were really, really hostile for that. And I was, in fact, a park ranger the very first year of the national park over there. I worked in the Gates of the Arctic National Park and the Birch Range in 1981, a year after it was established. And I can tell you that wearing a park uniform, ranger uniform, was like having a bullseye on the back of you when you walked around the towns there. But if you go to Alaska today, there's a whole lot more acceptance and happiness with the parks there. So I'm going to end with my stories here, but I want to make some key points, and that is that that public support from local people often is the common denominator. In fact, when I look at conservation issues around the history of the United States anyway, I find that's almost the universal given that local people, with maybe some exceptional people that are local supporters, generally are opposed to these things, and that most of these conservation efforts are established over the local opposition. And the message, or the take-home message I take from that is several. One, that just because there's local opposition to an idea right now doesn't mean it will last. That most of the time, in hindsight, the people are converted over time. Maybe it takes them, some of them to die, but anyway, the local populace gets to support these things. And the second thing I take from that is when you work for legislation to protect an area or something like that, to expect that opposition and not make too many compromises that would compromise the integrity or the quality of the area that you're trying to protect, whatever that might be. And realize that of course you're going to have this, and try to generate the popular support from a larger area to pass these things, and just hope that over time that opposition will see that it wasn't the worst thing that could happen, and often is the best thing that could happen to an area. So that's my little historical vignette. Thank you.
Nice. I wanted to start with a question for you all. Who can tell me what important event occurred in 1964? Passage of the Wilderness Act? Did you raise your hand, Jeff?
That was my
Anybody else? Well, the answer I was looking for is that's the year that Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer came out for the first time. So, but it was after passage of the Wilderness Act, because the Wilderness Act did pass in 1964 in September, and Rudolph didn't appear until Christmas. So I just thought maybe you might know that. Then I'm going to start with, we're looking at the Northern Rockies region, which I'm considering to be Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming for purposes of discussion tonight. And this region is extremely fortunate to have a lot of large contiguous wilderness areas. In fact, these three states have 10% of all the wilderness acreage in the United States. And if you add in Alaska, between Alaska and these three Northern Rockies states, those four states comprise 65% of all acreage in the National Wilderness System. So we're living in we're very fortunate to be living where we are in terms of wilderness. And then I wanted to move to, what are we protecting when we protect wilderness? People often stop when you ask them that question, and they're really not sure what to answer. So I just wanted to read a little quote from author Wallace Stegner. He wrote to one of his colleagues, "What I want to speak for is not so much the wilderness uses, valuable as those are, but the wilderness idea, which is a resource in itself. Being an intangible and spiritual resource, it will seem mystical to the practical-minded. But then anything that can't be moved by a bulldozer is likely to seem mystical to them." So clear back in 1960, before the Wilderness Act passed, there was an awareness among some conservationists that wilderness was more than just a landscape, more than just a place. It also is a concept, a uniquely American concept, I might add. And then Ed Abbey, recalcitrant author, he just put it much more simply. He wrote, "God bless America, let's save some of it." And so in 1964, Congress did pass the Wilderness Act, which established the National Wilderness Preservation System. And another question that often is debated is, are we protecting wilderness? Is wilderness to protect an area for something or from something? And the Wilderness Act itself addressed that question in the very first opening sentence of the Act, in which it wrote, it addressed the from first. It said, in order to assure that an increasing population accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization does not occupy and modify all areas within the United States. So essentially, to assure that crowding and civilization and its accoutrements and growing mechanization did not modify and occupy all land. So that's setting aside lands from those things. And then the opening sentence addresses the for. It is hereby declared to be the policy of Congress to secure for the American people of present and future generations the benefits of an enduring resource of wilderness. And so the Wilderness Act was passed to preserve the enduring benefits of wilderness for all generations. And so that is a forward-looking reason that the act was passed. So I would say that the from portion, in order to protect these areas from increasing mechanization and crowding and civilization, the from was the tool that was used to get to protecting these areas for something. The goal was to protect these areas for the benefits, the unique benefits that authentic wilderness can provide to the human spirit. So even though designating areas as wilderness can protect it from certain things, I think that the overall goal of the Wilderness Act is to preserve the benefits of wilderness, which are unique from any other landscape. Let's see. And then there's a perennial question that plays out in our culture on a periodic basis, and it affects wilderness as well as some other things. And that perennial question is, does size matter? And in terms of wilderness, the history of the Wilderness Act, the last 42 years since 1964, has focused on designating new areas of wilderness. We now have 680 areas that are designated as wilderness around the country. So historically, that emphasis in using the Wilderness Act has been highly successful in growing the size of the system that we have. The Wilderness Act created the National Wilderness Preservation System, and it is the largest protected area system in the entire world today, at pushing 107 million acres. Our National Park System is 82 million acres, our National Wildlife Refuge System is 91 million acres, and our wilderness system is almost 107 million acres. So wilderness, designated wilderness today, covers approximately 18% of all of our federal lands in the United States. So that's a significant size increase from 1964 when the Act first passed. But another question is, does designation protect wilderness? And designation is really the first step toward achieving that permanent protection for the enduring benefits of wilderness. Once an area is designated wilderness, it provides us then with a forever opportunity to achieve day-to-day, ongoing, on-the-ground protections. But the Act itself is just a piece of paper, and it can't achieve that alone. Therefore, achieving ongoing permanent future protection for wilderness requires ongoing citizen vigilance, and it will always require ongoing citizen vigilance. And that's basically the whole thesis of my talk tonight that I hope you'll take away, is that protecting wilderness requires ongoing vigilance. Designation is just a first step that stops some harms, but now gives us an opportunity to move forward and really protect the values, both tangible and intangible, that make wilderness unique. And since it's an ongoing challenge, I wanted to look at some of the challenges specific to the Northern Rockies region, but a lot of these challenges are really the same throughout the whole U.S. in terms of wilderness. And in terms of looking at, so what's happened to wilderness in the last 42 years? How protected is it now that it's been designated? And I would say that the goal of designating an area as wilderness is to hopefully protect the tangible and intangible values which are unique to wilderness, which nurture the human spirit, But what we've seen throughout the system and in the Northern Rockies is there continue to be a lot of day-to-day on-the-ground threats and harms that are occurring. And there's where the citizen vigilance comes in. Some people, citizens, Congress, and managers all need to step forward and constantly defend and protect wilderness from some of these harms that threaten to undermine the unique qualities, the unique values of wilderness. And I'm going to discuss them fairly briefly in terms of broad categories, because I find these are the best. Almost any harm you can think of will fit into one of these categories. The categories are motorization, commercialization, recreation impacts, manipulation, and now what we're seeing increasingly is a threat from the special exceptions in language that are being written into the wilderness bills that undermine wilderness. So I'll go through those categories pretty quickly. As the opening sentence of the Wilderness Act said, the Wilderness Act intended that wilderness would be a sanctuary from increasing mechanization. So when I ask people, well, do you think motors aren't allowed in wilderness? They all say yes. But in fact, there's a lot of motorized use going on in wilderness. For administrative purposes, managers increasingly use helicopters, motor vehicles, chainsaws, motorized cement mixers, bulldozers, motorized rock drills. All of these modern tools you are increasingly likely to see in wilderness and encounter these. Examples of why these would be used is trail maintenance projects. There's demand to open the trails after a winter when there's been, trees have fallen across the trail, and so some think it's quicker and easier to use chainsaws, or they don't know how to use crosscut saws. Helicopters are quick transport. Helicopters are on retainer increasingly during the summer months for fire protection, and so the agencies have already contracted for those hours. They've already paid for those hours. They might as well use that helicopter. And a common use of helicopters in the Northern Rockies is wildlife management. The state game and fish agencies increasingly want to use helicopters in wilderness. One example was transplanting non-native mountain goats into the scapegoat wilderness in Montana. Another example, which we beat back last winter, was a proposal by the Idaho State Department of Fish and Game to use helicopters to find, dart, and then land and radio collar wolves in the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness, which is the largest contiguous wilderness in the lower 48 states at 2.3 million acres. So we're increasingly seeing these kinds of uses for administrative purposes. A classic example, a major example right here in the Bitterroot Valley this last year was a proposal for legislation to allow road building in the canyons into the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness that lead to these old irrigation dams. The dam owners, they're owned by irrigation companies. The dam owners are required to maintain the dams to safety standards. They use them for summer irrigation. And hiking in or riding a horse in isn't as fast as maybe being able to drive in. So we faced legislation right here in Montana this year to authorize road building in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness to the dams. And almost every year we also see helicopters being used to fly into these dams and use motorized equipment for maintenance on the dams. So this is ongoing. This is happening almost every day. I can give you lots more examples. Okay, motorized intrusions by the public that are legal in wilderness, unfortunately, includes you can use jet boats in the Frank Church River of No Return wilderness, the largest wilderness in the continental U.S. You can use jet boats to jet back and forth up the river, which is a designated wild river right through the heart of the wilderness. And then airplanes are a huge problem in the Northern Rockies. There's an airstrip in the Scapegoat, some airstrips in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, and there were originally 7 airstrips in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness when it was designated, and all of those are open to public use. the Forest Service has decided they're so popular that a year or two ago they opened 4 new airstrips in the Frank Church Wilderness for public use, which Wilderness Watch believes was an illegal action, but there you have it. And these, in 1980, when the Frank Church was designated, there wasn't that many people who owned their own private planes, and outfitters were the primary users of these airstrips to fly in their hunting clientele in the fall, so because they can get into the heart of these wildernesses quickly by aircraft instead of several days of hiking or riding a horse. But with the stock market boom in the late 80s and 90s and the increase in wealth, there is a lot of private ownership of small airplanes. And today, there's about like 12,000 airplane landings in the River of No Return Wilderness every year now. And on popular weekends, it's a sport. It's called bagging wilderness airstrips. And pilots practice their touch and go wilderness landings. And on popular weekends, pilots report that they have to circle for 10 minutes or more waiting for their turn because there are so many planes, touching down on these airstrips in wilderness. Okay, so that's the motorization examples. And now I'm going to go to another category, commercialization. Commercial interests are increasingly gaining influence over what's happening with our designated wildernesses inside and outside the Northern Rockies region. And their influence is increasing both inside and outside the wildernesses. And I will give you some examples there. But first, a short quote from the 1800s from John Muir, who saw this problem coming a long time ago when he wrote, "Nothing dollarable is safe, however guarded." And he understood that if you put dollar values on things, they become commodities, and then they are up for grabs to the highest bidders. And one reason the Wilderness Act prohibits commercial enterprise is because Congress understood that if wilderness had to compete as a market value, it would lose, because timber, minerals, other resources would always trump wilderness in terms of dollar values. Now I'm going to read another quote, fast forward into the mid-1900s from Aldo Leopold, who echoes John Muir more than 70 years later. And Aldo Leopold wrote in 1949, he said, "Then came the gadgeteer, otherwise known as the sporting goods dealer. He has draped the American outdoorsman with an infinity of contraptions. The traffic in gadgets adds up to astronomical sums, which are soberly published as representing the economic value of wilderness." He actually wrote wildlife, but I just put in the word wilderness because it applies to this talk. So, and he was exactly right. So let me give some examples of commercial interest gaining influence over what happens to wilderness. And one example, I forget which year it was in the 1990s. REI, Recreational Equipment Incorporated, went to Senator Slade Gorton in Washington. I don't recall what the bill was that was pending in Congress, and they got the senator to insert language in the bill saying that, well, the Forest Service cannot manage wilderness for intangible values like solitude. They can only manage wilderness to protect biophysical things like erosion and such. And so there was an outdoor equipment gadgeteer, as Aldo Leopold would have called them, having a political effect on how wilderness can be managed, what values and qualities are important in wilderness. And for a lot of the sporting goods industry, limiting use in wilderness, and you have to limit use to preserve solitude sometimes, means lower profits. And so it's become very, very political. That's one example. Another example is the outfitters' influence in wilderness has been increasing. Outfitting used to be a mom and pop type of an operation. We're increasingly seeing larger companies taking over outfitting, and some areas where that has had an effect are like the wolf collaring proposal I told you about in Idaho, to helicopter and collar the wolves. Commercial outfitters were a big voice pushing for that because they make money off of bringing in clientele to hunt elk. And the elk herds in Idaho have declined because the forests after the big burns earlier in the century have been growing back and the elk habitat is decreasing. But the outfitters feel like if we can get those wolves collared, we can track those wolves and we'll know where they are and we can take our clients to another area where there are no wolves so that we can help assure that they will get a trophy elk. Okay. So that's another example. This last year, the Forest Service went in and blew up a natural log jam that flooding had occurred in the River No Return Wilderness, and the reason largely was because there were outfitted commercial river trips upstream of the log jam, and it would have interfered with their commercial schedules to have to carry their gear around, spend a day carrying their gear around this log jam, so we just went in and blew it up for them. It's also a question of access inequities. Increasingly, commercial entities are gaining more access to wilderness than the general public. In the River No Return right now, 1 in 23 self-guided people will get a permit each year to float the middle fork. But if you go pay a commercial outfitter, you can go every year as much as you want. Recreation impacts, and I'm going to run out of time. So in the Northern Rockies, recreation impacts in wilderness that are ongoing and increasing. I mentioned the airstrips, 12,000 landings a year. We saw a proposal a couple years ago from a commercial outfitter that since they can fly into the River No, at Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, since they can fly in, it was the Frank Church, the River No Return, then why not fly in wood-burning hot tubs for their guests? So at the end of their wilderness trips, they could soak in a nice hot tub in the wilderness. And so that proposal came from a commercial entity. We've got increasing push to develop radio repeaters and cell towers right around the rims, like in the Bob Marshall. There's new radio repeaters going in on the high peaks in order partly to make wilderness safer for people. They can call out on their cell phone and they can get contact for quicker rescue. So that's a recreational impact. Manipulation is one of the other categories, and I think David's going to talk more about that, so I'm not going to go into much detail, but some examples of manipulating the natural processes in wilderness include actions we take to prevent forest fires, fish stocking with non-native fish, predator control to favor more favorable game species, manipulating the presence and population of certain species of wildlife that are popular for recreation. Those are some examples that go on all the time in wilderness where we're in there manipulating the ecosystem to meet our needs, our perceived needs of the moment. Then I mentioned exceptions in wilderness bills. That language, it used to be after the Wilderness Act passed, every new wilderness after that required another act of Congress, and in the legislation, they would usually say, we're designating this and this and this and this area as wilderness, and these areas will all be managed in accordance with the Wilderness Act. So you could designate a lot of wilderness on one page of paper. But now we're seeing bills that are dozens of pages long that say we're going to designate these areas as wilderness, but then there's pages and pages of all the ways it's not going to be managed in accordance with the Wilderness Act. Some examples in recent legislation include mandating or allowing artificial water developments, which require bulldozers in wilderness to dig these huge holes and put in these big water tanks for wildlife management. Routine motorized access for state game and fish managers is increasingly appearing in legislation. We can't go in with motor vehicles, but they can go in with aircraft or motor vehicles or ATVs anytime they want. Mandating new recreational developments that don't currently exist. We want it to be wilderness, but we want to go in and develop it too. Motorized recreation is being written into some bills. The Wild Sky Bill, which is in Washington, would allow floatplane access by recreationists in the wilderness. Those are a few examples, and in closing, I just want to go back and reiterate that protecting wilderness, designation is the first step, but protecting wilderness in an ongoing and enduring manner requires constant vigilance and involvement of citizens, of Congress, of land managers. And then I just want to leave you with a brief closing thought and a question. And that is, the thought is, the future of wilderness begins today. And the question is, will it be civilized or will it be wild? Thank you.
I want to use my time to talk like Tina Marie did about what we do with these wilderness areas once we set them aside. As a society, we've made a major investment in designating wilderness areas. When I started working on wilderness issues in the 1970s, there were less than 100 wilderness areas. A friend of mine had once given me kind of a brochure that had pictures of all the different wilderness areas, and I thought, I'm sure I could really do this, but I almost thought I could develop a mental image of what all these places look like. And it's not like being to more than 300 of them like George has been, but now we have close to 700 individual wilderness areas. Another thing that's always interested me, Howard Zahniser, who was the primary architect, writer of the Wilderness Act, was once asked in congressional hearings, how large could this system possibly get? He said, oh, probably max of, can't imagine it being more than 50 million acres. Well, we're now over 100 million acres and climbing, and we have more work to do, certainly here in Montana and Idaho and the Northern Rockies. There's lots of additional lands that, in my opinion, need designation. But the real problem is that, completely in contrast to that heavy investment in designating these areas, we're investing almost nothing in taking care of them once we set them aside. The agency I work for, the Forest Service, spends, I think it's less than 1% of its budget on lands that constitute close to 20% of their lands, and I think the other agencies are probably even worse. Most of the NGOs have no interest in stewardship at all. In fact, many of them will shy away from talking about management issues at all for fear that it'll scare people away from supporting attempts to designate lands. There are groups like Wilderness Watch that are exceptions to that, but few. And then finally, the public doesn't step forward. The public does not demand quality stewardship of our wilderness lands. I think there's a general tendency for most people to not think that there's any problem, not demand any changes. So I guess my first point I want to make is that I think the future of wilderness will be determined at least as much by what we do with the lands once they're designated, then with a designation process. And we're only going to have quality wilderness stewardship if the public stands up and demands that. And so far that's not happening. Tina Marie went through a number of stewardship issues. I just want to highlight a couple that I think are a couple of the really big issues, and I think of them as dilemmas, because in my own mind, it's not all that clear-cut how we need to come down on a couple of these things. But how we deal with these dilemmas is what's really going to influence the values that our wilderness is going to provide into the future. The first one I can state as a question: to what degree should we allow heavy recreational use of our wilderness areas, particularly those wilderness areas that increasingly are being designated right next to large metropolitan areas that are where there's incredible demand, particularly for day use. I've been involved in some projects in Oregon and Washington, and some of the wilderness areas right out of Portland and Seattle. There's a place, Snow Lake, which is up in the Alpine Lakes Wilderness, where we've done a lot of work. If you go up there on a Sunday, nice Sunday in the middle of summer, this is like 1 hour drive, 1 hour hike from downtown Seattle. You'll pass another group on the trail on the average of every 3 minutes. So wilderness areas are supposed to provide outstanding opportunities for solitude. If we allow that level of use, are we meeting the mandate of the Wilderness Act or not? If you talk to the people that are up there, you'll actually find out that most of them are not getting their ideal experience, but they will tell you that they're getting solitude, most of them, 90% of them. And they're also getting many other wilderness-related values. Interaction with nature in a highly scenic environment, lots of wilderness values. I think the other thing we need to think about is what happens if we tell 90% of those people that you can't come here. What are they going to do? Are they going to go to the next trailhead and cause crowding problems in a place that hasn't had them before? And is that a good thing? What if they stay at home? Will we be losing the support of people for wilderness? Or what if they stay home and watch TV and contribute to non-healthy lifestyles, obesity, all the other kinds of problems going on in our society? What's best for society? What's best for wilderness for dealing with this sort of issue? It's a much more obvious problem in some of the more heavily populated parts of the country than here, but we're seeing it here. How many of you go up the Bitterroot Canyons and pass other people every 10 minutes on the trail? And 50 years from now, what's that going to be like? How should we deal with that? Second dilemma is the appropriateness of ecological restoration in wilderness. I think there's a lot of kinds of manipulations that Tina Marie was talking about that it's very clear violate the Wilderness Act. We shouldn't be dumping non-native fish into lakes that never had fish before. But there's some other restoration issues that are a little bit more subtle than that. One of the goals of our wilderness lands is to preserve them in a natural condition, but we've got all kinds of human influences going on in the world: climate change, fire suppression, air pollution, recreation, livestock, lots of things that are driving these systems away from their natural state. So shouldn't we do something to push those systems back towards that more natural state? Flip side of that is the Wilderness Act talks about wilderness areas being untrammeled. What untrammeled means is not controlled, not manipulated, where the wilderness gets to decide what it's going to be like rather than humans getting to decide. So even humans deciding to make the wilderness the way that it ought to be, if we weren't doing all these other things like climate change and fire suppression, is trammeling the wilderness. It's creating it in an image which is our image, even if that image is a natural environment. Should we do that? This is a huge issue in a lot of the smaller wilderness areas. There's a wilderness area in Virginia, St. Mary's Wilderness, where acid deposition in the rivers has lowered the pH to the point where much of the natural ecology of the river has been lost. Forest Service ended up deciding they would dump lime periodically in that river to bring the pH back up to its sort of natural level. Is that a good thing to do? Is that a bad thing to do? Is dumping the lime in is bad? The loss of all the native aquatic habitat is bad, which is worse. A big gum swamp wilderness in Florida. There's a lot of Florida wilderness areas that are the way that they are because every 3 years or so fires would burn across the wilderness area. Now the fires in that sort of area will often start from lightning strikes, but strikes that when the lightning strikes far from the wilderness area and then burn over very large areas. We can't maintain those natural conditions by relying on lightning strikes actually hitting in this dinky little wilderness area. So our choices are that, well, this is again another case where the Forest Service has gone in there and is lighting fires in those wilderness areas to return that system to more semblance of what it was under natural conditions. But that's a trammeling act. We have issues along those lines here in the Northern Rockies. One of the big ones here is the loss of the white bark pine throughout much of the Northern Rockies, largely as a result of an exotic pathogen that shouldn't be here, but also exacerbated by fire suppression and lots of other things, and there are manipulations that we could take that could be effective in preserving a lot of those white bark pines should we do that. So two big dilemmas. My concern, I guess what I want to leave you with today is I think we need more definitive policy than we currently have related to a lot of these issues. Times have changed since 1964 when the Wilderness Act was written. The population of the United States has increased 50%. Use of our wilderness areas has increased sixfold. Our understanding of ecological systems has changed radically. We used to think that systems were more static in equilibrium. Now we change and unpredictable futures is what we understand. I don't think there was much recognition of how widespread human impact was. I mean, there's no place in the most remote part of wilderness that isn't affected by human activity. Another interesting thing about this dilemma is that we didn't listen to early recommendations that what we need are multiple different kinds of wilderness areas. When the Wilderness Society was first formed, I think it was in the 1930s or 1940s, they wrote up a little platform about what they were all about. And they said we need actually 5 different kinds of wilderness areas. One of those they called extensive wilderness, and that's very much like the language that was used in the Wilderness Act. These would be large areas devoted to primitive recreation, symbolic values of humility and restraint would be an important part of that. But they also talked about the need for what they call primeval wilderness, where naturalness, natural systems is a primary goal there. These would be representative examples of all the different ecosystem types that would exist out there. And they also called for what they called restricted wild areas, which would be places that would look natural. They would be located close to large metropolitan areas, providing places for people to escape to. So they saw early on that all these were important values. We needed all these things. Their recommendation, we should have different kinds of wilderness for that. We ended up calling it all one thing, and now we're stuck with these dilemmas of how are we going to achieve all these values using just one kind of wilderness in one definition. So I think what we need is some sort of societal debate, referendum to talk about wilderness values, to talk about the wilderness that we want in the future, and to make some decisions about these dilemmas and to build policy based on that. Because if we don't develop more policy, then what we're going to get continuing into the future is fighting all the little battles like Tina Marie was talking about. We're going to have endless decisions by all these mid-level managers that exist out there that are just trying to seek sort of compromise in these dilemmas, trying to find some non-controversial way to deal with the political realities out there. And thousands of these mid-level managers making these decisions, moving on, different people coming in, making different decisions spread all over is going to create a very mediocre system in the future. And the only way I can see that we can get away from that is to write much more definitive policy. So those of you that care about the future of wilderness, I think several things: demand quality, stewardship of our wilderness lands. Think about how you feel about some of these dilemmas I've raised, and then advocate for more definitive policy there. Thank you.
All right, why don't we open it up to question, answer, comments? Anyone have questions, comments?
Just to kind of, I don't know, maybe push what you were saying, Mr. Kroll, about the concept of wilderness. I mean, in some ways, looking back over the Wilderness Act and, you know, its language, and given the whole debate surrounding wilderness that's occurred in environmental philosophy with people like William Cronin and Stegner and a lot of those other people that you referenced, aren't we in some ways sort of dealing with a bankrupt concept in that it houses so many internal contradictions that we're almost constraining our avenues of approach to real protection and movement forward by sort of hankering on to this untouched land area. Does that make sense? I mean, doesn't it seem that the concept itself is kind of hemming us in to where it's limiting our options to really bring about effective policy changes and bring about areas that, while they may not accede to the level of wilderness as it's written in the Act, they would have more value to us in the long term.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I'm not sure my thoughts are fully formulated on that, but I think that is a real risk that we need to be concerned about. I don't think it's a bankrupt concept, and I think what we need to do is look at the potential that it needs to evolve as the needs of society and wilderness evolve. Another thing I really like is what Tina Marie said about shifting from thinking about it as in a reactionary sense of protecting things from to emphasizing values for. We need to, somewhere it hit me, wilderness is one of the most reactionary concepts there is out there. It's sort of like the world's going to hell, let's just stop and save some of it. We probably had to do that at one point in time, but to go forward into the future, I think we need to make it a more inclusive, positive thing about what are the benefits, what is this going to serve for, and I think we need to think more broadly about all of society. That's where, I guess I really am concerned that if we build a fortress around places and people can't go out and recreate, what does that mean for some broader issues in society?
Either of you two have comments?
Has much thought been given to the philosophy of bringing in the surrounding or contiguous landforms around wilderness and making people aware of the intrinsic values of some of those properties, public and private, in terms of conservation of natural resources, preservation of their intrinsic values?
Well, I'm not quite sure. I'll try to stab at answering that. I think there's there is a movement to understand that there are values on lands that aren't necessarily designated as wilderness. Various concepts about core areas, which often tend to be wilderness areas as sort of ecological preserves, but then having what might be called buffer areas around them where protection of natural values is still highly sought, but may have certain things permitted or allowed that would never be allowed in the designated wilderness. Sort of a zoning system, so to speak, and then, a final area beyond the buffer would be the places that we see as developed landscapes. I don't know if that gets at what you're trying to confront, but there are many people thinking about that in broad landscape terms and having proposals for protecting, like a good example is the Yukon to Yellowstone conservation initiative that seeks to try to protect lands all the way from Yellowstone Park up into the Yukon by having a whole bunch of stepping stones of either parks or wilderness areas linked by these corridors of lands that we would call the buffer areas that would try to maintain naturalness through those corridors areas so that these core areas are not isolated entirely and cut off from each other. So that say, a grizzly bear or a wolf might be able to move from one core area to the other, but they might not necessarily set up, large populations in the in-between areas because it wouldn't be quite as suitable for them.
That makes sense to me, and it seems like it might be easier to convince the public to to support wilderness if they see it as a broader picture of the whole.
Well, you hit on exactly that is why people are putting together these proposals, because the thought is that if we can put it in a larger landscape concept, that it becomes more, you see the bigger picture, so to speak, and why any particular area along that linkage might be important, and therefore not to leave certain areas out that would be critical to keeping that whole, the good ecological health of the whole region.
And there, in terms of federal lands, probably the most concrete proposal out there right now is the Northern Rockies Ecosystem Protection Act, which it's been around for a dozen years. It's got 188 co-sponsors and hasn't moved, but it would be unusual in that it looks at the whole Northern Rockies region, and the core areas would be wilderness and the national parks, but it looks at other federal lands that are those migration corridors, and they're not maybe as pristine, but they're necessary to connect wildlife with other areas. And so those areas would be designated like wildlife corridor areas that have less protection than wilderness would have. And to create these linkages on this whole tri-state area and show the public what it means for their land values, that these areas are not available for commercial logging, or they would have been logged, and some of them have been logged in the past. And that's the third area that these areas would set aside, is restoration areas, that they would be restored from past human uses and become wilder over time. So it would create different kinds of land classifications over a broad, the whole ecosystem. And maybe we'll actually get a hearing next year on it now with the changes in the House and Senate.
I'll say one more thing. I mean, some of these approaches have been pretty systematic. I was involved in a study of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem where we tried to look at the biological values of all the lands, then look at their current status and look at their threats to those, and try to come up with a ranking of which lands had the highest biological value, and then which ones were under the greatest threat, and then use that, or it was being used by conservation groups to identify lands to try to protect based on that assessment. And this has been done in various other parts of the country as well, and including sort of almost a broad North American approach by the Wildlands Project, which tried to do sort of that whole continental-wide system of linkages, core areas.
Thank you.
David, you talked about the need for better policy, and it sort of reminds me of the United States often talking about the need for more democracies, and then it seems like every time some country establishes a democracy and has a vote, we don't like the way it turned out. We decided it wasn't really democracy we wanted, we just wanted a new leader. So I'm wondering, when I hear you call for better policy, something tells me that you have in your own mind your ideas of what that better policy should look like. It's not just better policy, because that might lead to policies that are something that are totally unacceptable in your mind. So I wonder what you have in mind for what kind of policy would address the concerns that you raise.
Well, actually, your analogy is a good one, because the words I should have used is more definitive rather than better. I mean, I guess, so what I'm saying is, and I know there's differences of opinion on this, I think the wording in the Wilderness Act is wide enough to drive a lot of trucks through. And I would like to see the decision space narrowed down. So I would like to see our policy be more definitive. But what do I exactly want to happen? I guess that forces me to realize that I'm a fence sitter to a great degree on both of the dilemmas that I laid out. I see problems with either course of action with either of those. And so largely what that leads me to, which is why I talked about what I think was this early on wisdom about having different kinds of wilderness areas, is that we need different designations to meet these different different values. We need some designations, lots of lands that are very uncrowded, but we need lands close to large metropolitan areas that can absorb lots of recreational use. We need lands that maybe we manipulate a lot to provide representative examples of closest thing to natural systems that we can have. We have other lands that we don't manipulate, that we let them become these novel, wild, but not very natural lands. That's the closest. So if I could be king, I think what I would do would be to try to build a system that would designate different lands for those different purposes with tightly constrained policy for those different classes of land, rather than leaving this big wilderness category with very loose language that I think is going to just gravitate towards sort of mediocrity over time.
Jeff?
Kind of looking at this reactionary idea of wilderness and looking forward, though, if we were to achieve sustainability, that is, if humans on Earth decided or actually achieved some balance with nature that we could say is truly sustainable, where would wilderness fit in that vision? I mean, where's the wildness that I don't know exactly what I'm asking, but it just seems like, how do we reconcile the wildness that exists within us and this social, or I should say civilized being that doesn't necessarily want wildness?
I think we do need real wild wilderness. And I agree with David that a lot of the areas we have are probably never going to be that. But I think we always need to have places that are really wild, and then we need to keep them wild, not bring them down to these other levels of the way less wild areas are being treated.
I have a question. It intrigues me that we think that we should constantly control nature. That bothers me, like his question, it's kind of the flip of it, maybe we don't want all that wilderness, or some of us just want to be real civil. But then there's this other thing of, we keep trying to control everything and we keep messing it up. And we really are messing it up. And so, and then you're saying, well, now we need to designate 4 more categories to manage wilderness. And, I can empathize with that, but even so, we're still, every time we manage, and when we can just take a look at our history, we blow it. Since somebody addressed that, I'm pretty confused.
Apologies.
Well, that's pretty awful.
I'll give you my opinion on it, which is just from observation. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the best opinion, but I've read a lot of different ecological papers, and in school I took every ecology course they offered here at the University of Montana over the 12 years it took me to get a bachelor's degree. So I took a lot of ecology courses, and the sort of the take-home lesson I took from all those ecology courses was this very thing that you said, that no matter what we have done to try to manipulate the environment, often with the best intentions, we did not fully understand or comprehend the full consequences of that manipulation, and it's come back to bite us or create new problems that we never anticipated. And that's made me, on a personal level, come to the conclusion that the least amount of manipulation possible is usually the best course of action over the smallest area to do that, accomplish that, and to allow what I would call more natural processes to operate on as large an area as possible. And I talk about wildfire as one example, but I use the example of how I approach mosquitoes. And I put on mosquito repellent, and I have a mosquito netting in my tent, and I have mosquito screens on my house, but I don't advocate going out and killing all the mosquitoes out there. In other words, I try to maintain a small area that maybe I find unacceptable for mosquitoes without trying to manipulate the whole landscape so that I'm mosquito-free. And you know, and I realize there could be a great deal of debate among everybody about what amount of area has to be mosquito-free and how much land do we manipulate or not manipulate to get to points. And even recognize, and this is the dilemma that I'm sure that even David was referring to, you know, we have some places that have been, the trajectory is so different because of our past manipulations to try to get it back on a trajectory that might be self-corrective. You know, what do you do? Like, for example, again, using my opinion on reintroduction of wolves. I think wolves have a great influence on wildlife, and I see that. So the introduction is a manipulation in a sense, but it's just to get the ecological process of predation back there. And then I let the wolves decide, you know, which elk or deer die or don't die, and so forth. And so, again, allowing the natural landscape to the greatest degree possible to
Yeah,
operate.
and not letting the helicopter go in and put collars around them.
Right, and also
In certain areas.
and in my view, I would let the landscape decide. You know, if it's a harsh winter and elk die, well, that's the way it goes. You know, and if the wolves kill a whole lot of them, that's okay with me too. And I'm not going to try to say there's the right number of elk to be out there, or the right number of deer, or whatever. And so I'm very suspect of anybody who thinks they know the right number,
Thank you.
or thinks they do.
Well, I would just like to follow up. If our wilderness systems are largely self-corrective, then the future may be easier. But from most things I read, and I think what the climate change type people are saying, I suspect that that's not the case. That in fact, all the different things, all the different human insults tend to make the trajectories just go wilder and wilder. So I think we're going to face our trajectories going way off out here, and that we have to constantly provide pressure on them if we want them to be back within a more natural realm. So our choice is going to be either to let them go way out here. So that's wild, that's novel. We don't play God, but we certainly have wilderness ecosystems that are highly influenced by human activity, or our choices are to try and push them towards something that would be closer to what they would be like if they weren't human influenced, but that require playing God, constant human decision about what we're doing, knowing that we don't really know what we're doing. Neither choice, in my opinion, is a good one. Do we throw all of our eggs in one or the other basket? I mean, that's where I end up being a fence sitter, because neither option is very good.
Well, I'm gonna disagree with you a little bit in that that wildness is so novel, and that we can go back somehow, because there's no going back with global warming. We're not in control. You know, it's been taken away from us, and things are going to be different. We can't go back, and I think that in order to have places that still feed our wild spirit, like Jeff was mentioning, we're going to just have, the only way we're going to have places like that can nurture the wildness in us is if we practice restraint for at least those special places that we as a society decide are going to stay wild. The only way they'll stay wild is if we restrain ourselves from trying to fix anything or change anything or direct trajectories. That's my comment. Everybody, you guys can all jump in.
I had a comment that I'd like to get your reaction to. David, you had talked about mediocrity over time with current wilderness areas that are already designated. And tonight's panel has more focused on those places that are already designated wilderness than I thought it was going to. I thought we were maybe going to talk about designating a little bit. But I think it's been educational for everyone, myself included, as someone who has joked with George, who's with Wilderness Watch as well, that the organization must have the easiest job in the world. You're protecting lands that are already protected. Of course, I'm joking about that, and we all see how all these threats to these areas. But on the same level, it seems like any new wilderness proposals to designate new wilderness, with the notable exception of stuff like Narepa, which Tina Marie mentioned, is from the get-go watering down wilderness to such a point. Tina Marie talked about, the bills being, first page will say it's designated wilderness, and then the next 10 or 12 pages will be all the exceptions to that. We have examples here in Montana or Idaho of allowing grazing, allowing motorized access in these new wilderness bills. The bill in central Idaho that would give public land, national forest land, just to these communities and these counties for economic development. And where do you all, what's your opinion on how we should go about designating new wilderness areas, and where do you see this? It seems like a current trend, maybe it's always been there, but this current trend, where do you see it going, and how is that going to affect the character of the wilderness system in the future?
In national recognition, and we're getting widespread support from across the whole country. Is that necessary to make that compromise in order to get it designated? And in my opinion, it'd be better to hold off for a couple of years until the politics is better for protecting without that exception in there, because then you wind up having to fight it, the consequences of that forever and ever, like the airstrips, Frank's Church, and so forth. And of course, those who want to get it designated right away would tell their side of the story would be, well, we may never get it that way. And I tend to feel like if a place has growing national support, it just continues to grow, and that you can eventually overcome that local opposition to get protection, and that it might be better to wait until the time is right politically to do that. But that's, you can argue that either way, but there's a lot of history to support it.
Well, what is the full name of the Central Idaho bill? Because I think that's somewhat
The
enlightening.
Central Idaho Economic Development and Recreation Act.
Yeah.
And it's a wilderness bill.
Yeah, for example.
Supposedly. Yeah, I think it comes down to the question, what are we protecting when we protect wilderness? And someone at Wild Rockies Rendezvous, which is a regional gathering every year in the fall, conservationists throughout the multi-state region, somebody made an interesting comment there that, because we were discussing these controversial bills, and it's really separating the conservation community or dividing the conservation community. And he said, wilderness activists are different from forest protection activists, because forest protection activists feel like they've protected something when they've prevented a harm to something. And wilderness activists, he said, don't feel like they've done anything unless they pass a bill, pass a wilderness bill. And it was very interesting. Until they designate something or call it something, they don't feel they've protected anything. And I thought that was a very interesting insight. And I think it gets down to the question, what are we protecting? And I would favor David's suggestion for let's call it something else. There's all kinds of other categories: national scenic areas, national recreation areas, national conservation areas. These have all been used elsewhere, and they can provide many of the same protections. They can provide whatever we want to write into the bill, including a lot of wilderness-type protections, while leaving out the things that we're not willing to really do, like if we want motorized use, or we want no use limits or something like that. These areas can stay free of logging, free of mining, free of ORV use, but not quite meet the criteria in the Wilderness Act. So, your thoughts? Or?
Well, it's interesting listening to all these comments about kind of the intellectualization of the wilderness and what it means, and I appreciated your comments, Tina Marie, about the restraint. But you look back at the history, and William Cronin does this pretty well, but also Braudell's book, The Wheels of Commerce, where he talked about the wildness of Europe impeding commerce. The whole idea of Little Red Riding Hood and the Black Forest, these were very real things that impeded our ability to sleep at night without fear, to live with food and know that we can continue to get it. So it's not like we're hardwired to overcome wildness. And now we're in a situation where we're in this odd situation where we're trying to steward it, we're trying to protect it, we're trying to keep little bits of it intact. And I think the brilliance in the Wilderness Society's proposal years ago, Dave, was the fact that they actually talked about these gradations of wildness. And I think they put a lot of thought into that. I've always been an advocate of that as well, because I think they perhaps intuited that if you have wilderness, then that's kind of like this pinnacle. It's not just rocks and ice, but this wildness is this pinnacle for understanding what stewardship could be if it were to flow down in all these different levels of understanding interrelationships of land and ecosystems. And there was far more intact land back then, far less mechanization, far less pressure on destroying or altering that land. And today, we have all these high-intensive uses and abuses, and we haven't really learned what stewardship is. In fact, we've been, I think, more humbled by the intercomplexities of what these ecosystems are, and yet we're the only almost default we have is to, well, let's just preserve it. And maybe sometime some of us will learn about some of the complexities, and maybe stewardship will flow from that. But I don't know if that's necessarily happening. And perhaps in the studies that we do, in the designations that we do, in the protections that we will eventually get more of, I suspect, we may learn more about what stewardship is. But I think that people and wildness can exist. I think they can coexist. And I think the gradations of that wildness is something that we really need to take a harder look at. And then we need, I believe, we need watershed or broadly regional planning that has teeth in it, so that you really do have a blending of humans, commerce, commodification, and wildness. I think there are different levels of that can all mix. It's like a mosaic, like you see with fires. But the other issue, like George brought up with the Yellowstone Plateau, is the very attempt at making these places special also makes them extremely attractive. And without any kind of planning to know what's going to happen there in the next 50 years, they will literally be loved to death. And that's an issue I wanted to put out to George, too.
Well, I wanted to respond to something that I thought of before that, if I may. I just wanted to give you an example of sort of the value of just, if I may, sort of leaving things alone, because there's a good example from Yellowstone, and that is for years, of course, throughout the West, we've persecuted coyotes. And there have been all sorts of studies on coyote behavior, social behavior, and ecology. Lots of them. And all the studies that were done, most of them were done relatively well. And the findings that you would get from those studies would be reasonable conclusions to make from those studies, except for one thing. All the coyote populations in the West that were studied were all persecuted populations of coyotes. They were coyotes that were shot and poisoned and trapped constantly. And so finally, somebody did a study, a guy named Bob Crabtree, in Yellowstone Park. And it was the first study done on a non-persecuted population of coyotes. And he found out coyote behavior is entirely different than all these other studies that have been done before about how coyotes are supposed to behave. He found in Yellowstone, the coyotes act a lot like wolves. They formed territories that they maintained year after year. They had group dynamics where older coyotes would do most of the breeding, and the younger coyotes, not the pups of the year, but the 1- and 2-year-old coyotes would help assist the older coyotes in raising the young, again, much like wolves. And the average age of the coyotes in Yellowstone was much older than in outside populations, where all the studies showed that coyotes generally are in small groups, or one, or couples, you might say, and that was the normal behavior. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that here, in some ways, I really do think we have to have some large areas where we just sort of step back and allow processes and wildlife and natural processes to interact And then we will gain some insights from that have application to other places. And that all the policies, and here's policy implication, all the policies that we've had in place about coyotes do exactly the opposite of what we profess that we want to do. In other words, when you go and kill coyotes and trap them, what you do is you open up a vacancy which allows younger coyotes to come into that place. Younger coyotes tend to be less experienced hunters, therefore they're much more likely to take livestock and cause conflicts with humans than if you don't kill them. And that goes contrary to everything that we've thought about, all the research and so forth. And it wasn't until somebody studied the coyotes in Yellowstone that we could find out. It's still not widespreadly known outside because the people that want to kill coyotes don't want that to be known. But that's a point where, an example, I think, of why we need large areas without manipulation.
Final question, final thoughts?
George?
Just maybe sort of an observation, folks can respond to it. I think part of the problem that we have when we talk about wilderness a lot of times is for one thing, we've forgotten that really wilderness is sort of the natural order of things for at least probably 99% of the time in North America since the earth dried off. And you know, humans have been here a relatively small percentage of the time. So the idea of places being sort of left alone and to their own devices is you know, not at all inconsistent with what's happened for so long. And when we start talking about wilderness, and especially designated wilderness, we start to focus on it as though it's the only part of the land base out there, and that it has to meet all of the demands that we put on, that we want out there on our public lands. You know, and I agree with much of what David said, and this gentleman over here. But we have the opportunity for those gradations of management out there across the landscape, remembering the wilderness is, you know, maybe 1 out of 6 public acres is wilderness, but only maybe 4% of our whole land base in the country is wilderness. It seems like we have all kinds of opportunities to achieve all these other desired goals that we have out there and all these other experiments we want to do and all these other opportunities. And the wilderness is the only place that we've ever set aside and said, this place we're going to allow to be wild. If we don't allow wilderness to be wild, what's going to be wild? Or does everything have to be affected by us? And so that's just a comment.
Well said. Well, thanks to our panelists, and thanks for coming. And drive, walk, bike safely home. It's getting icy out there, so